就谢谢大家，今天就是有下雨，而且很多。等一下，我再等我关个。先谢谢大家在这个下雨的时候来参加我们见面会第21场。然后我是数位荒原的主编周文琪，然后我也是我们这个计划就是数位荒原驻站暨群岛资料库计划的主持人。然后我们今天是这个计划的第4次发表，第3次发表，对，第3次发表。然后我先大概介绍一下，就是我们这个计划。最主要是将数位荒原它提出的这个运作的一个模式，包括文本，然后跟社群还有跟网络的一个联动的方式，把它转换成实际上我们去东南亚实践的这个的一个就是以这个模式为主，然后去做一个实践这样。但我好像忘记，就是我们今天主要讲者不是我只是大概稍微先简单介绍一个背景。然后我们主要讲者是 Jianguo Rahman，他是从吉隆坡来，然后但是 moderator 就是跟今天主持人其实主要是策展人柯念普，他是现在不是独立策展人，因为现在有工作不能叫独立策展人，对。好，但他也是我们的研究员，在吉隆坡。那他稍待可能他会先，所以你是用中文，可以先简单介绍一下，就是你们所认识。就是看你啊，就是你可以先稍微简单介绍中文你是谁这样嘛？对，就是关于你的部分这样。好，就是等一下他也可能会简单介绍一下自己。就是 I was talking about that I will give a little background of this project, and Alice will introduce herself. She can conduct in Chinese first, then she will introduce you, and you will conduct in English. Yeah, OK. 所以我们继续讲一下，就是我把这个讲完，我的部分讲完，这是大概，我们大概。就是这是我们在想象中，这个社群跟这个交流计划之间，它有几种可能的运作的方式。然后，因为我们的计划里面有一个很重要的词是就是 Nusantara。其实我们一般如果你去网络上查的话 ，Nusantara、Nusan 跟 Andra， 它就是在爪哇语里面，它就是其他的岛。或者有点像是我们现在讲说 international 这样的概念，可是它这个字其实是从13世纪到16世纪，从爪哇就是在我们现在看到的最中间最大的那个岛是 Borneo 下面那个横的这个东西，这个也是现在印尼中间包括日惹、包括雅加达所在的这个岛，也就是爪哇岛。那我们看到这个红色，其实我是从维基百科上抓下来，它红色的范围就是曼加巴希这个帝国，它从靠近日惹那个地方，慢慢的从最一开始一点点，然后慢慢的向外扩张，就现在开始扩张，然后它开始扩张到最顶峰16世纪，然后当时也面临了包括回教势力还有葡萄牙人抵达，所以他们当时。是以一个海权这样中央的观点，但是并不是一种好像我们现在理解的nationalism， 这样它是有一个边界这样子的国际的一个想象。也换言之，它是一种替代性的一种世界观。那当然这个词我们一开始就是提出这个努森达阿开的时候，没有很确切去。对于这种替代性的想象多做琢磨，好像比较像是一种隐喻。那但是我觉得慢慢的，它好像它的重要性好像在我们在看我们现在跟东南亚交流的时候，会越来越浮现这样。I'm almost finished. OK. 然后比如说像我们现在看到这个是在 你看到这个边界是当初在这个边界里面，其实吉兰丹它就是格兰丹，在现在马来西亚北边这个地方，它其实是被划在那个暹罗，也就是现在泰国里面，那是在英国人跟现在的马来西亚的，当时是跟就是暹罗的国王在谈判划定他们边界之前，所以我们会看到说，其实我们关于现代这种民主国家或现在这种交流的想象，常常就是它是非常它非常有限，也不能处理所谓的到底region 或者 local 或者是 area， 我不知道这个，因为每个词它可能就是我们不能很适切的去处理这些，就是我们现在在使用这些词的时候，其实它背后可能都会牵涉到它是怎么样一个政治的一个想象。那好，所以这就是大概这个计划我们现在运作的一个模式，这样。那爱丽丝她其实在我们这个计划里面，她的角色是她在担任 Rumah Adat Library， 就是在吉隆坡这个地方，她是担任调查和研究，所以她也对于吉隆坡的一些背景、一些知识生产的一些社群相当的了解，这样。那因为开始计划资源比较有限，所以一开始并没有邀请到那个 Zicky 这样。那还好，就是因为 Zicky 他现在还好，就是很幸运的，就是因为 Zicky 他现在在交大念雅技书院的，对，所以我们现在很荣幸他能够就是趁他在台湾的时候，有大概就是可以邀请他来做一场分享。那当然他做的计划也非常有趣，然后也有很多比较不一样、另类的一些 reflection， 所以也许等一下包括他自己和克连普可以多就这方面介绍。然后，所以当然我们还有最后一次的发表会是昆曲的那个 Tina， 她会做最后一次发表。然后最后就是很快的给大家看一些有趣的资源，因为其实像我们驻站地化的那些海报，它背后其实是就是有一些可能大家会很好奇，为什么我们用一些好像贝壳或者是一些动植物的图案去作为我们那个海报。其实它是安文博物志，就是这一个他是一个博物学者，然后德国的博物学者，他当时在 Rubius， 他当时在安文，就是印尼的安文这个岛做了相当多研究，那他也非常同情当地的一些土著的一些立场。后来他在世的时候没有机会去把他这本书出版。那这本书现在在台湾的台湾图书馆其实也有，当时在日本那时候他们也收藏了一本就是这样子的实体本。那我现在这个资料是在荷兰这边，它有免费可以下载。那我就觉得这个东西是非常有趣，然后我把这个东西变成这里面的一些图档，然后变成我们海报设计的一些素材，大概只是一个小小的插曲。好，那我这个很简短的开场大概讲这样，然后因为大家可能雨天比较晚来，所以我现在才正式的开始。然后接下来我把主持棒交给科内尔普，但是我还是建议你坐这边好不好？好不好？大家比较好看。
好，非常感谢各位雨天的时候还过来，然后也非常谢谢这次雨蛙跟数位荒原这次有机会可以邀请Zikri 还有我支持我去马来西亚做研究这个部分那就如同刚刚雨蛙刚刚介绍的这一次的这个 program， 我就不再多详述。那主要就是这一次的这个讲座， 我们考虑到就是缺少翻译者这部分，我们等一下还是会用英文去做介绍跟说明。然后如果有任何疑问或是觉得不太清楚的地方的话，都欢迎询问Raiki 这样子。那我先简单的介绍一下，那我直接开始用英文了。Okay. So the talk will conduct in English, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and thank you very much. We are delighted to welcome Zikri here. And Zikri actually is a curator and researcher based in KL, and he has led a number of research initiatives, urban and literature, and also the social movement public project in Malaysia recent years, including also several intensive public programs. So currently he has joined the graduate program in Jiao Tong University, and so now he can join us in Taiwan here. And also his project engaged a lot of in the social movement in a social realm, and above them the design also welcome to participants, also welcome to the public or citizens that this kind of public program. So I will talk a little bit how we met. The first time we met was in 2014 in KL. There's a 2-week program called Transaction in the Field. It's a workshop and also organized by the Lost Contemporary Art Space in KL and also Gotha Institute. And the program actually gathered a lot of curators from Japan, Hong Kong, China, from Asia region to share their thoughts and practices about how they engage with urban studies and public field, and also how they conduct the research project and engagement art in this kind of contemporary art field. So in the workshop, actually Zikri shared his involvement of the Buku Jalan. And Buku Jalan actually is a public reading space without any involvement of a bureaucracy started in the year in 2011. But today he will present another project of his friends, and the project actually called the Literacy. Actually the project is a cultural and literature mapping project of KL, and the project opens a lot of discourse and archive and research, particularly to talk about the human dimension to build a more like humanist city in Kuala Lumpur as a case. So most importantly, the Literacy actually mapping projects to uncover several layers, and the main 3 aspects of this project is involving to the building of space and the interpretation of KL as a body of literature in its process. And also one important part is the publication of this project. Maybe you can see from this book. They also interview a lot of authors, writers from the 1970s to the present to talk about how the imaginations built up in KL from the 1970s to 2015. And we will discuss in the Q&A sessions like why from the 1970s. Actually 1970s is quite a crucial time, not only from KL but also in Malaysia, because that period of time is the immigrants from the countryside to the urbans. So it's time of urbanization to start in KL, and also it is the time that separated the language and also the economic policy and political policy also happened during that time, changed the contemporary KL and Malaysian. So I find this kind of project is very touching and in line with my own projects, and I hope really appreciate this kind of opportunity. So I'll pass this for Zikri to share his project.
Hello. Hello. Thank you, Alice, and also Ricky, for inviting me today, and also to Nusantara Archive. So I'm Zikri Rahman, as in that's been introduced before by Alice. So today I would love to present about my project, my still ongoing project of literacy, mapping space and literature of Kuala Lumpur. So how do we actually map a city? So where do we start? Because in Kuala Lumpur, the dominant ideas of mapping is actually where Kuala Lumpur started is actually the confluence of the Sungai Gombak and the Sungai Klang, which is the Klang River and the Gombak River, which is near the convergence of Masjid Jami area. So that's where the dominant history tried to depict Kuala Lumpur, where is it started. But is it true? But is it true, especially from the perspective of literature, for example? So that's why, because the ideas of mapping, especially if you're going to look at from colonial period, is very much problematic in that sense, because Kuala Lumpur itself, in several mapping projects conducted by the British, they didn't mention several places which they assume it is not even a structure, especially the Malay population area. So for them, it's not part of the city. So that is one of the problematic that we can see in terms of the dominant mapping that we face through this project, for example. So that's why we try to look at the potentialities of using literature as a means of mapping through literacy. So from there, basically the outline of this particular project, I would like to thank my my project partner, Rion Saidi, and also Nurul Aizam. They are both are publishing publisher and also writer based in Kuala Lumpur, which collaborated together for this particular project. So in this particular project, I try to like impose or try to like not to theorize, but to conceptualize. Is there any possibility for us to how do we actually build the city with words? And the second word is memeta kota dengan kata, is how can we actually build the words, the city through words? Because that's also important, because most of the time the concept or the ideas of urbanization only coming through the economic dimension. But if we're going to look at through different, for example, this kind of project, we're using literature as it means of understanding the city. How can we perceive the space by dissecting the writings of literature figures in this in Malaysia, for example? And then the third one, is it possible for us to deconstruct the city by looking at their literature works? Because just now Alice mentioned about this several publication. So from there, we actually, how do we actually conducted the research project is through going through the archiving process of more than 100 different form of literature, consisting of short stories, poems, novel, and also drama scripts. But the limitation that we have for this particular project is that we only managed to document only English and Malay literature. But we are in the process of documenting the Tamil and also Chinese literature, because in order for us to understand this particular city of Kuala Lumpur, we have to be able to master or even to understand the different language, because this city is actually being built by the migrant. Most of them are actually like the immigrants and also immigrants. So there are two different connotations there, immigrants and also immigrants. So I'm going to discuss about it later in this presentation. So coming back to the ideas of cultural mapping just now. For this, for literacy, we only focus the literature works from 1970s until now. Why we actually focus on 1970s, I'm going to elaborate more in the second part of the presentation as well, because 1970s actually provide a very interesting time where several contestations, several racial riot happens in Malaysia that actually prevailed another national cultural policy, which actually affects the whole literature or even cultural production in Malaysia until now. So we can elaborate further on that later. And also, Coming back to the publication, for this particular publication, we actually also document the whole literature text that we use, and also several interviews with several literary figures. Because before this, I guess this is the first time that we actually try to engage with several cultural workers and also literature figures on how they actually envision the cities through their works, through their literature works, for example. So from there, we actually have several, not only contestation, but intertwining of several ideas about the city, of which I'm going to elaborate more further as well. And then, what is actually the function of a map? When we actually see a map, it's a continuous process, it's a rhizome, it's a continuum where something that is yet to be achieved is something that is lingering around us. So for a map, because for example, if you're going to read certain literature texts, we don't know what exactly is happening. So that's why the literature mapping is important. So as you can see in the some of the map that I actually spread around, you can see how there is no coordination or how to say, as in proper coordination like a proper map that we're going to use, because we try to envision it as a cognitive mapping. Cognitive mapping is something that is very much related to the experience of literature itself, where we try to envision certain spaces, not only by coordination, but the emotion, the melancholic feeling that we experience through the literature text. So from this, maybe that's what the most important thing about this particular project is actually try to map out the whole emotion, the humanistic dimension of the inhabitants of the city. So, yeah. Moving forwards to the, as in for this particular slide, you can see how several, we actually have more than 100 different literature texts, but as in for now, I'm actually focusing only on like 6 or 7 texts. So I actually derive it from different books, like here, there's a graphic novel, and also a short stories compilation, an essay anthologies, poem anthologies, and then the drama script anthologies. So this is the area that we try to focus on. It's a 5-kilometer radius within the confluence of Sungai Gombak and Sungai Klang just now, the river where it first started. But we try to, the reason why we have this certain location is not to say that this is the starting point, but it's a matter of how can we start, because the ideas of positionality within the producer, the literature producer is important as well. What I meant by positionality is where they actually derive their own experience, where they actually derive their own understanding of the city. So it is important in this for this particular project. And then, moving towards, this is the map that you can see that I share with you around. Yeah, so we actually have several quotations from the books and all to instigate people to understand more or to read more about the project. And then, the second page of the map is actually some quotation and some synopsis, and also some of the places that have been mentioned in the books. Yeah. And then, so coming back to the ideas of mapping, how can we actually start with the ideas of the mapping itself? So is there any particular aspect of literature or even artworks that we try to be included in our project? So when we first started, we have to look at 3 different aspects of it, which is the aesthetics, the discourses that it brings, and the authorships of the work that we try to focus on. So because the question of aesthetic is very important, because when we see the city as something which is very much prefigurative, it is something that we actually envision in daily basis. When we first started, it's continuously producing itself. 3 different aspects. So from there, it actually being captured through the aesthetic of the literature works. What I mean by the aesthetic is that every city in the world, I guess, for sure, is it's a continuous process of transition and also migration. So that's how the city was being built at the very first place. I guess even in some connotation of like Louis Mumford, in his book, he mentioned that the city actually been built by remembering the death. So when we actually have a tomb or someone is dead, so that's why we're coming again and again to offer some offering or something. So that's the idea of most of the cities being developed. So that's how, but in this particular context, is it true? Or is the death of the forest, or is it the death of the ecology in the city previously, or even the displacement of the orang asal, the indigenous people, the population within the city? Is it the death that we want to revisit time again and again? So that's one of the particular aspects that we have to explore continuously. And then coming back to the question of aesthetic, just now I mentioned about how it actually captures the transition and also the migration. So from there we can actually see in several works, for example, just now I mentioned to you the graphic novel on your right hand side by Lat. It's actually a graphic novel. So it is being published during the 1980s. So from there you can see the first starting point of the migration, the urbanization process in Kuala Lumpur. And then another one that I would love to actually to compare or to actually to open up the perspective is that a work by, it's a novel called America by Ridwan Saidi. Is available in Malay language only. But you can see how the positionality that I mentioned to you just now on how for several writers, for example, the writer for Matsum, he's actually from outer of Kuala Lumpur, which is like 300 kilometers away from Kuala Lumpur. It's the northern part in Perak of in Peninsular Malaysia. So when he actually arrived in Kuala Lumpur, the sense of feeling disorientated, feeling of dislocation, or even disorientation, you know, those kind of feeling is being captured by him in these particular works. But through America, another novel that I mentioned to you, so maybe I can actually like give a synopsis of the novel America by Ridwan Saidi. So the novel actually depicts a life of an architect living in Kuala Lumpur. But what I would love to explore more is actually the possessionality of the writers himself, because Ridwan Saidi, he's born and bred in Kuala Lumpur. So you can see how he captured certain things compared to Matsum is completely different, because the character in Matsum is very much feeling disorientated towards the city. He's feeling alienated as well. But through Ridwan Saidi's novel, the character actually enjoys the condition of the city. Like maybe for some of us here, we enjoy the life in Taipei, but not for some other people living in different part in Chiai or Tainan, maybe because it's completely different logics of the city. So from that, that's the certain aesthetic that is much important for us to map through this particular project. And then besides that, the aesthetic is also the question of space. So what I meant by space is that the development of the literaturescape within that particular era of 1970s until now. For example, because most of the time in Malaysia, it's like the setting of the literature writing is mostly about the rural area, the village and all. But the 1970s actually marks the point of where the transition of from the rural literature to the urban literature. So you can see how they conceive certain kind of space, how they produce space is completely different at that particular era. So there is several things that we can actually discuss further onwards. Yeah. And then the second question is actually the discourse that it brings, because this is the three aspects that I mentioned on how are we going to select certain works. So for example, it's like the aesthetics of the literature works. The second one is the discourse that it brings, because it is also important for us to comprehend the logics of the city. Because for example, in Kuala Lumpur, we have to understand that there is certain tendencies of natural and also unnatural policy that happens. What I meant by natural and unnatural is on how the externalities actually, the economic externalities, like the economic policy by the government actually influence the migration, especially happening during the 1980s from the rural area to the urban area. So that's a certain discourse that has been captured by several writers in their literature works. So that is one dimension that has been captured again and again, actually. And also the experience of the city as a post-colonial city. Earlier on, I did mention on how mapping of the city is very much problematic, because the British, during the colonial period, didn't actually look at certain Malay village as part of the city, because it just made of some dilapidated or some rundown Malay village, like a very only wooden house, so it's not real structure for the British. But coming back to the ideas of literature, it's a process of how can we actually envision the representation of some kinds of national identity. So for example, we have a work, maybe in the map you can see there are several works which concentrated in the middle of the town. Maybe we can try to focus on Dataran Merdeka, is the Independence Square in Malaysia. So it's very much it's a propaganda space by the existing government, for sure, because they try to impose our understanding of certain space in Kuala Lumpur. But through literature, we can actually counter those narratives where people actually can tell that, oh, maybe the Independence Square is not really independent in that particular sense, because there are several interesting political situation that happens in Kuala Lumpur during the 98, during the Reformation period in Malaysia. So for them, it's for some of the literature figure, they try to reclaim the ideas of the Independence Square itself. So from there you can see how the discourse was being brought from time to time by the literature works. And then the third one is the authorship, the question of authorship. I mentioned to you several times about the positionality just now, but I would love to quote James Joyce in his novel Ulysses, where he mentioned that I want to give a picture so complete that if the city of Dublin suddenly disappeared from the earth, it could be reconstructed out of my book. So that's James Joyce's imagination for the city. He want the people actually, if something happened, earthquake or something happened to the cities of Dublin, we can rebuild it from his novel. But is it the same thing with Kuala Lumpur condition? Because I don't think so, because we don't have enough strong works to actually to capture the imagination of the city. It's very much like a patchwork. It's very fragmentic in nature. So I guess that's the best way for most of the author on trying to reimagine the city through their literature. So for example, if because the question of mapping itself is for us to go beyond the politics of the canon, because just now I mentioned about on how people will think James Joyce when we talk about Dublin, for example, or even Nakib Mahfouz in Cairo, for example. But in Malaysia, we don't have any specific writers that can actually capture the whole imagination of the city, which is, for me, it's very interesting, because I mentioned to you about the politics of the canon just now. The politics of the canon is something, for example, if we're going to understand certain things, we must read certain things. So this is not a problem in Kuala Lumpur. So coming back to the question of authorship, I actually elaborate more just now about on how the differentiation between Mak Som by Lat, the graphic novel, and also a novel by Ridwan Saidi called America, on how they are both from a different generation, of course, but also from different positionality. One born and bred in Kuala Lumpur, and another one is actually the immigrants in his own city. So for sure the concept of the whole city is completely different. So coming back to the question, because this is some of the work, some of the aspects that why we choose certain works. So we can move forward to how are the cities being imagined and how is the communities being imagined. So there are four literature works that I would love to share with all of you. It's like the first one is, this quote is, "I know who I am. I don't need an identity card to prove who I am." It's by Liu Putin. It's a drama script actually. But the irony of that particular quote is actually the character Ang Tau Mui. Ang Tau Mui. She is actually being asked by migrant workers who actually work as a guard to produce her own identity card in her own city. So you can see the question of citizenship, the question of nationality is very much embedded within the city construction as well. Because in his own city, in her own city, she was being in a way discriminated because of her outlook by some immigrants. So it's very interesting in that particular sense, because in Kuala Lumpur there's a huge migration flows happening until now. And then the second one is the KL Engkau Lesbian, which can be loosely translated as KL You Are Lesbian. It's short stories by Faisal Terani. He's very much an acclaimed literature figure in Malaysia. So from this particular book, it's very interesting because there's a vagueness, there's some kind of blurred lines between KL as a character and KL as a space. Because when you actually read about the short stories, KL is actually, in a way, the pseudonym of a person, a character in his short stories. So it is very interesting in that sense. And then through this particular short stories also, Faisal Terani actually he actually give a name of a place in Kuala Lumpur as Kowloon, after the name as an area in Hong Kong, Kowloon. So when I actually first read the novel, it's like, oh, maybe he tried to like depict Kowloon as in Hong Kong. But when we actually interviewed him, he actually mentioned that, Kowloon is a nickname for there's a place called Chow Kiat area in KL, which is mostly populated by the Chinese workers during the era of 1970s until now actually. So it's very interesting on how the name of the space has been moving from one place to another. And then the third one is from a graphic novel, Mak Som, Kuala Lumpur Waktu Malam, Saya Sudah Kenal dan Sudah Rasa. Basically it's Kuala Lumpur at night. I've already felt you and I've already known you. So it's about, in a way, from what my understanding is about the question of fatalism, on how the character Mak Som actually like becoming more fatalist towards his condition in the city. So for him, the life in the city is something that he have to endure in daily basis. He have to survive in order to live in Kuala Lumpur. So the transition, the comparative is very much to compare between just now I mentioned Ridwan Saidi, the American novel. The character actually enjoys the hardness or the hardships in the city, which is very much different with Mak Som, for example. And then the last one is Akulah Pelacur, Manusia Paling Mulia di Kota Ini. This is actually from a drama script, the lowest one, from Johan Jaafar, from the play entitled Kotaku o Kotaku, which loosely translated as my city or my city. So basically, he tried to position himself as a prostitute in the city for him, because the city is actually a space of contradiction. This is where most of the people actually accumulate wealth, like very violently. But at the same time, we can see homelessness happening everywhere in the city. So this is his way to reclaim his rights of the city, which is very much interesting if you're going to go through the text. I'm actually going to share some of the selected text to all of the audience today so that we can actually continue our discussion further, maybe the next time. So, and then, yeah, from there, from this particular aspect of imagined communities and also imagined cities, I'm actually would love to elaborate more on the last selection of which on how the cities actually captures the multilingualism of literary space, the contested production of literary representation, and the third one is the mutating literary ecologies. So the first one, the multilingualism of literary space. As you can see in the map on your left-hand side, you can see the space in the city is very much, the logic of the city is being formed or configured to the ideas of, it is a very much a racialized city. The composition, you can see there, but the thing is so small, is so in the upper area, you can see that it is actually a Malay area where the confluence of the river in the city, and then in the oval shape, underneath it is the Indian space of the city, and then the last one is actually the Chinese space of the city. So from there, this is actually the logic that we inherited from the British colonial period until now. So what I would love to elaborate more on the multilingualism of literary space is that on how certain space in Kuala Lumpur was being represented in the literature works from different races. Because it's very much important because, for example, in the city of Kuala Lumpur, you can actually survive by knowing only one language. For example, if you know Chinese, you can actually survive anywhere in the city because it is a very much plural city. So anywhere you can find like Chinese or Indian or even the Malay or even English-speaking community there. So, but how do they actually represent each other in the literature work is important. For example, in a literature work of a writer named A. Samad Ismail, in his novel, he actually depicts certain area, like in Brickfield, like Indian populated area, as an area which is a black area. What I mean by black area is the area we know or we identify as a place of prostitution or gangsterism, those kind of thing. But with the Chinese, when they actually try to imagine the space of the Malay community, for example, in the area of the Malay community, like in the Jalan Tunku Abdul Rahman and all, it's really hard for us to grasp the understanding of the area because they rarely go beyond their own boundary. For example, it's like this is especially true during the Reformation period. So why I mentioned the Reformation period is during the 98 situation is at that time most of the protests happening in the area, in the Malay populated area of the city. So there is that one particular moment where most of the Chinese writers actually being involved in the political situation, and they try to write a poem about the space. So their understanding of the space is something which is politicized space, something that is a counter-state narrative of the space, which is very much different from certain imagination. For example, it's like for the Malay community, when we try to look at our own, because I'm also a Malay, so when we try to understand our own city is when we try to mention, oh, this is the Malay area, this is all a mall area, for example. It's a shopping complex area, it's something that we're going to buy something during the festive period, for example. But when we try to mingle, or when we try to understand certain spaces by using literature, it tends to be quite problematic in that sense. And then, yeah. And then, besides that, I would love to elaborate more on the formation of language as well, because formation of language is interesting in Malaysia. Just now, Alice did mention about the project happens only after the 1970s until now. Why we specifically choose the 1970s is based on several conditions, where after 1969, the 13th May racial riot happening between Chinese and the Malay, there's a situation where the writers or the cultural producer at that particular time tried to go against the state narrative, because in the year 1971, the government actually tabled a policy. It's a national cultural policy where in order for you to become a national literature or a national arts and heritage entities, you must write in Malay language. So that's the logic. So when it happens, it actually being captured in certain literature works. For example, you can see there's a confluence. There's also what we call several cohorts of writing group that actually writes in English in order to challenge that narrative. So from there, it derived the ideas of national literature and also the sectional literature, which is until now that has not been solved until now actually in Malaysia. So that's how the formation of language through literature, and it actually been captured in the space of Kuala Lumpur. And then the second one is the contested production of literary representation. So what I meant by the contested representation is actually, earlier on I did mention about the space as a means of propaganda. We actually use space to signify or to understand it as a nationalistic perspective. But through literature, we try to decenter those kind of production. So for example, there might be several places in the literature that has not been recognized by the state as something which is valuable or as something which is as a heritage, for example. So there are several poems that mention about Jalan Belakang Mati, which is mean the end road, and which is they're actually being captured quite a lot actually in several literature works. But for us, for sure, if we didn't actually do a research about it, we don't really know what exactly is that particular place. And then there's also a space where most of the poets actually converge in the city. It's called Bawah Lampu, and Belakang Tembok. Bawah Lampu is underneath the lamp, and also Tembok is actually a wall. So from there, it's like you can see a different space actualization process has been produced by certain group of people. So that's why I focusing on the contested production of literary representation just now, because for them, for the government, maybe for some of the spaces it's not really important, but for those who actually continuously producing it, it is something important for them. So it also coming back to the third aspect of it, which is the mutating literary ecologies. What I meant by literary ecologies is something, because we understand the cities is continuously producing itself. It's not only the physical aspect of the city, but also it's actually a state of mind. What I meant by a state of mind is for example, most of the city, especially in the modern city, the building was being built for the inhabitants to follow the logics of the city. So how literature can actually provide a certain sense of countering those kinds of logic. So for example, I would love to touch on like the concept of heterotopia, for example, of which been coined by Foucault further. So heterotopia, for sure, is the condition of the city in different places in the world is different. But the concept of heterotopia, the envision of between the dystopia and utopia, another space, we're actually continuously producing it. For example, in the work maybe during the 1980s in Kuala Lumpur, for most of them, they actually reacting towards the physicality of the space in Kuala Lumpur. But early on in 1990s and all, it becoming more complex. They actually try to rethink about some spaces beyond the physicality of it. What I mean by physicality is, for example, it's like a conversation in an email, for example, because that's why I mentioned about the KL engkau lesbian just now, the KL you are lesbian. So the short stories actually captures an email exchanges between different parties. So those kind of spaces that have been mentioned several times in the work is something what we call heterotopia, although we are positioned in the actuality as in the actual space, but at the same time we are actually being moving from one place to another. That's what we try to capture in this particular project. And then the last one is in, so this is the last slide. So you can see how the Kuala Lumpur mutate itself from just during the 1974, 1954, 1924, 1895. So from very small area, it's only in Chowkit area, where it's being called Kowloon just now, I mentioned to you. And then it's being expanded into a larger area. But for now, this is kind of obsolete as well, because the government actually tried to build like a 60-kilometer radius city. It's called, I can't remember it specifically, but they tried to enlarge the boundaries of the city as well. So what I meant by the mutating literary ecologies is that how can we actually capture this particular context of literature, or even the development of the city through literature. For example, I guess in Malaysia, it is common, not really common, but it's not worsening, but it's becoming more scarce. It's becoming more hard to find a village inside the city. What we call maybe in Indonesia is forest, not forest village, hutan, Banda kota apa? Desa kota. Yeah, desa kota. So the concept of desa kota, which is very much important as well, on how are we going to capture the evolvement of the literature production in Malaysia. So yeah, maybe that's it for now. Maybe we can have a more discussion. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I would like to update more details of the Literature Cities project. Actually, the talk, as Zikri just mentioned and sharing, is a part of the research and mapping in this project. But actually the project is kind of a public project. They curate a tour in the KL to invite participants or citizens to join the tour to visit different sites. And so at first they do the research of the literature and urban in KL from the 1970s to the present. But after that, the curators, for example, Zikri and Ridwan, selected the texts and lines from the literatures, the novels, the poems, the books, and give it to the artists. They also invite several artists to join this project. And so the process is like the artists try to reinterpret the lines and the texts from the research from the certain novels or poems, and to do the performance in the tour. So they have a walk through all the certain kind of space and sites in this project. And so it's kind of very interesting that have different layers in this project, how the artists to understand the novels, to understand a certain narration from the writers and the novelist. And maybe you can deliver more about this part. Yeah.
So the tour is actually being, is it okay? It's in the mic? Is it working? Hello? Yeah. As in, yeah.
Maybe several examples, or to talk a little bit details about this public program, about the tour.
Maybe I can actually start from here. Yeah. Yeah. As in, for this, just now, Alice mentioned about the literary tour. So it's called Literatur. So yeah, it's a literary tour. So basically, we actually like focusing on 5 to 6 different literature works, and also we actually collaborated together with 6 different artists. So just now, so from there we actually moving from one place to another. So the reason why we actually focusing on doing this kind of this tour is actually for us to experience the cities, and also to see how the transformation of the text into its actual spaces. Because from there we can experience the city is one thing, but also how can we actually understand a certain works within its own specific time and within its contemporary setting. So for example, we have a work by Maxom. There's this one artist called Sefa. I'm actually, is it possible for us to like show some video or something? Maybe we can show afterwards. Yeah, because I don't have it here. It's not on YouTube. It's on my laptop. I forgot to bring. Yeah. So it's like, because we're actually moving from one place to another. So there is this one artist called Sefa. He's a pantomime artist, a silent artist. So he becoming the character of Maxom, the graphic novel on your right-hand side. So he's walking from one place to another, like mimicking his everyday life. Because Maxom is actually a journalist. So the way he wear his clothes, and also the way he actually like engage with people by using pantomime as a medium is very interesting. Because I did mention to you on how Maxom felt very alienated and also feel disorientated in the city, because he is not from the city. He is from Perak, the northern part of Peninsular Malaysia. So the ideas of using pantomime to represent the artwork is interesting, because it shows how the character itself can't really comprehend or can't really voice out his instinct or his experience in the city. So that is the reason why we choose certain medium to depict certain or to portray certain literature works. And also there is this one artist called Pudin. So this one is very interesting actually, where he's actually focusing on the KL, You Are Lesbian. I think this is the anthology of the short stories by Faisal Tarani that I mentioned to you about the KL, You Are Lesbian. So the short stories is actually being recorded during the 98 Reformation period in Malaysia. So the people going out to protest. So that's where the first time that the word sodomy has been like used widely in the mainstream media to accuse the deputy prime minister at that particular time, Anwar Ibrahim, as someone who actually did the act of sodomy towards several of his accomplices. And then that sparked the Reformation period. So the writers actually tried to capture that, tried to capture the imagination on how violent the city can be, because when he actually mentioned the KL as something as do Kuala Lumpur or even the city actually have a sexual orientation, or actually have gender to start with, for example. Do we actually believe in it? So the writer tried to problematize it in that sense. So coming back to Puden just now, there is this one interesting incident where the police actually come out to the court by bringing a huge mattress as what we call the court, how to say, evidence. Yes, yeah. So he brings the whole mattress as an evidence as an evidence in the court to accuse Anwar Ibrahim of doing the act of sodomy. So the artist actually responding by bringing his own mattress from his house, maybe 7 kilometers away. So he dragged the mattress from his house to the city center, tried to depict or to portray the blurring lines of the private space and the public space at that time. So we can see how certain aspect of literature has been used to understand a contemporary setting and condition at that time. So that is why we actually develop literary tour in a way to capture not only the experience through words, but also the transformation medium of performance art, for example. Yeah.
Some of the texts that involved in the performance actually provoke some collective memory from the public, right?
Yes.
For example, so my question is that during this kind of tour and performance, how the public reacts or how the citizens react to the artist's performance that reintegrated certain kind of Okay, so so my question is how the public or audience to react or to understand this kind of performance. The artists reinterpret the certain texts and certain plot from the novels and from your research. And to my knowledge, also one of the novels or the writer also joined your tour during that time, right? So how the author understand this kind of reinterpret performance from his work?
I guess because I'm not the curator of the literary tour. Ridwan Saidi is the curator actually. From Mocha Mocha Inc. So he is actually the curator for this particular work, but because we actually working closely together. So coming back on how people actually perceiving the literary tour as a means of understanding the literature. So I guess it is being mentioned in his curatorial essay here. He did mention of using happening art as something which is not being replicated, which is very much different from the experience of reading the text, for example. Because what I meant by happening art is something, for example, we have a performance or we have an object. So from there, how can we, or even most of the participants of the literary tour can actually react to certain kind of condition or even the object that have been presented by the artist. So coming back to the question of the collective identity or how certain people see differently and all, it is interesting because in the work of Mat Som, I really love to actually to go back to the work of Mat Som in a way because maybe a personal bias that I find that Maxim is a very interesting graphic novel. It's something that maybe all of us can actually understand Kuala Lumpur in its own logic through this cartoon actually. And then coming back to the question of collective memory just now. In the Maxim graphic novel, he actually depicts the in-migration of the people from Peninsular Malaysia. It's like from different states in Malaysia coming over to Kuala Lumpur. But when we actually did the tour, the whole space that has been mentioned or being depicted by the artist is completely different. Why I said it's different is because it's no longer the immigration, but it's coming over with the immigration of the foreign workers from different parts of the world. So you can see how the different layers or the social fabric has changed tremendously when the writers actually try to reimagine or try to portray the space at that time. So it's very interesting when we actually like doing it like in a contemporary time. Suddenly it's suddenly it's working. So suddenly it's like, oh, okay, this is a new kind of social fabric. And also coming back to the formation of language just now. Maybe in the earliest time we are talking about, oh, is it possible for us to include like Chinese or Tamil literature in our documentation? Of course, but in the future there might be some people, the immigrants from Africa, actually going to contribute to the heritage of Malay language, for example. We don't know. So how can actually literature can capture those kind of collective production of memory and also production of knowledge? So it's very interesting in that particular sense. And then just now you mentioned about there is one artist who actually been involved. He is also a character in the Maxim novel. He's actually a real life poet. So when we actually invite him to become one of the performer for our literary tour, he's more than happy to involve with us, because he felt that in order for him to reenact back his character in the novel, the graphic novel, to a real life situation, it must be a real, like very, how to say, as in completely different experience for him. So his name is Pian Habib. So he's been in the literary scene quite a long time. Just now I did mention about there is one space, bawah lampu, underneath the lamp, and the lamppost, and also tembok, the wall. So he is also one of the senior member or one of the pioneer of doing those kind of literature and also literature sharing session with the public during that time. So for him to reenact back his situation or his experience at that time is different, because it's no longer there. The wall is no longer there, and then the lamppost is no longer there. But we walk through where he once passed through in the graphic novel. So for him, for sure, it struck him directly in that time.
Okay, so anyone have like questions or? Yeah. 所以大家有什么问题，或者是有想要表达的一些想法，都可以欢迎在这时候提出来。Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dina. I have a question. If for Zikri, if you have maybe plan in the future that you will facilitate the productions of works, like literary works, because at the moment what I see is more what you did is more connected the city itself and how it's being represented in literature. But would you interested in producing literary works based on, I don't know, map or being in the city, and so rather the production, not only making the connection.
Yeah, thank you, Dina. It's actually being produced. Actually, we actually have a website, so where we actually engage and also encourage people to share with us their KL favorite literature works. So it's like an open source where people can actually just say, oh, I love this work, so maybe you can put it online, for example. So that's why we are doing it right now. And then coming back to the question of producing literary works, do you mean that I'm actually like writing one or compiling one, or for this project itself is a documentation of several interviews with different people. So, and then the next process is actually to document Tamil and also Chinese literature in Kuala Lumpur, because we have a limitation in that sense, because I'm not being able to read Chinese yet, but I'm learning now. I hope so. Yeah, so even in Tamil, because the question is very complicated. Maybe we can elaborate more further on the production, because in Malaysia, there are not many people who are actually writing Tamil literature. So we have a problem in that sense. But for sure, there must be but there must be several literature works that actually depicts about on how the Indian community lives in the city. But it's a matter of how can we actually unearth it. Yeah. So, and so about the Chinese just now, we are actually collaborating together with several partners of it. So maybe we can produce it by like maybe next year or something. And then another production in line is we're thinking of actually producing a documentary, like working with several literature figure that we have interviewed to talk about the space in a real-time situation. So maybe we can invite there's this one literature figure called Isamat Said, because he's very much he's very much lives in the city. I guess for most of the writers in his age, maybe he is only the one who actually lives in the city. For most of them, for most of the other in his contemporary or his angkatan or generation is actually living outside. So that's why when I mentioned earlier on about the transition between the rural literature to urban literature is significant as well. Yeah. Is it answered? Yeah.
I just have a question about how, okay, there's a lot of space involved. Sorry, I was really late just now. But I just, there's a lot of mention about space. And so when I think about space also, there's been a lot of things going on in Malaysia in terms of its politics. And so there's been a lot of protests going on. There's a lot of Bersih protests going on, and that takes up a lot of space. And people are meeting up in different points, and people are moving from one point to another, and so there's a lot of movement, a lot of taking over the space, in fact, from the government in that sense. So do you have any kind of a project that actually looks at what people think when they're on the streets, right? And they're moving, and that's a very rich trove of possible stories that you can get about people, their feelings about politics, and their feelings about politics whilst moving in the city. I remember once there was Bersih has all these tweets from Bersih 1 to Bersih 4 or 5, right? And there are all these little short collections of all these things that people talk about as they're walking around. I was thinking, if, do you have any plans about putting that together to turn that into a bigger story, or do you have any plans to put together all these bigger stories of people who have ever been involved in Bersih into a more substantial work? Thank you.
Thank you. Listen, it's very interesting because for sure it's like Kuala Lumpur as not really a city of protest, but there's a culmination of protest incident that happens. In our consideration, when we actually try to document several literature works, for example, there are several protest incidents which is very interesting. For example, there are Keranda 152 protests. Try to, it's very nationalistic in that sense, where they try to propagate the Malay language as the national language at that time. It's Keranda 152, but it happens in the early 60s. But then we actually have another one, is the anti-PPSMI. There's a protest against the teachings of maths and science in English by most of the literature figures. For example, A. Samad Said is also involved. So he actually penned down several poems about it as well. But then, and then also for sure, it's like during the Reformation period, in the 98, there's a lot of, maybe I have to retract back, there's a lot. It's not a lot actually being written about Reformation period, especially in the Malay literature, but not in English literature. Because this is what we get actually from our interview with Faisal Terani. He's like quite a very influential literary figure in Malaysia. So he mentioned that during 98 Reformation period, most of the Malay literature community doesn't actually take side, which is quite problematic. In that sense, it actually affects the whole corpus of the literature during that time. But it's very interesting when it comes to Bersih era, where suddenly people like Pak Samad actually directly involved with Bersih movement, but not during the Reformation period. So you can see the trajectories where people actually document more and more about Bersih. But it is also because there's a whole new dynamics towards the political integration through Bersih, where people of different races actually comes together to produce or reclaiming space, the idea of space just now together, which is relatively quite rare or scarce during the Reformation period or before that. Because Kuala Lumpur is actually a city of contradiction. Why I say that is because it's being assumed as a Chinese city. But at the same time, there's a lot of people from different races living there as well, but majority are actually Chinese. So for them, Kuala Lumpur is not part of their collective memory in that particular sense. But that's why, yeah, I can actually show you this book as well. It's very interesting, Kuala Lumpur and Putrajaya, because Mahathir, the fourth prime minister, the former prime minister, he actually tried to envision a new administrative capital. So for him, Kuala Lumpur is like a Chinese city. We no longer can reconstruct or deconstruct the meaning of it. So we need Putrajaya to actually to infuse his like tendency of Islamization and also the postmodern architecture in that particular space, because the logic of Kuala Lumpur itself, it is on how Kuala Lumpur expanded. It's not like how we understand the city of Paris or even the city of Putrajaya. It's sprawling around. Yeah. But the question is different. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Actually,
is it okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. Taking over this whole thing. Okay, so in 1998 there was the internet was just kind of sort of expanding, but even when the anti-ISA protest, that was 2008, and then after that this Bersih, it was because of internet itself that kind of expanded the whole thing, and therefore maybe that was kind of it was more able to capture everyone's attention as well. Could that be also one of the possible? Because there was a group of people who were kind of iffy about whether they wanted to join Reformasi or not. Okay, whether they wanted to give their voice to it. But with the ubiquity of this thing called the internet, right? There's all these different platforms, Facebook and all that. It made it seem really, yeah, to the point that everybody and everyone could access it. And it was an issue, right, that I guess to a certain extent also transcended things like race or even religion, right? I mean, who would want to go against free and fair elections, that kind of thing. So.
Utopia, which is being done by Michel Foucault. So he did mention was the production of space beyond physicality. So maybe that's where it will come from actually, the condition where people actually like doing literature by navigating in the betweenness of physical and abstract space. So internet is where it's coming from, and also the work by Rani. Just now I did mention about how people actually communicating through email exchanges. So it is actually a way to capture the Reformation period, but through different perspectives. Yeah. So yeah.
Okay, I also want to make some comment. First of all, the book is for sale, so because 这前面他讲的第一句话在描述那个 Gale 的，他其实是一个中国人，但是他这个书是一个英文的书。那所以刚才他其实有提到说，因为我是在回应 Zicky 他刚讲到说，我们用中文，就是因为他不懂中文，所以我们没有办法完全去捕捉，就是好像没有办法去再现中国的那个记忆。但是其实，我们看到其实事情没有那么单纯，因为你选择用什么样的语言去写作，其实有时候并不是因为你是什么样的种族，有时候还牵扯到一些在线的政治。但我这不是一个 critic， 这比较像是一个它会牵扯出更多很复杂的脉络。I was talking about that sometimes for taking the first text for example, sometimes the representation of certain languages doesn't necessarily to be the representation of certain ethnics, because it is very complex, especially when regarding to the multi-linguistic environment, such like KL or some other cities in Malaysia. So for this one, it's Ang Dao Mui, Hong Dao Mei. It means in fact, you have to read it. You have to have the ability to understand the Canton Hokkien is in fact a Hokkien. It means the Ang Dao Mui, red bean girl. Yeah. So in fact, it's referred to a Hokkien. So it's in fact referred to Chinese, a Chinese Malaysian. So you can see the dynamic is very complex. It's not totally a representation of the English, or it's not. In fact, it's in fact Hokkien. So I think the challenge behind this project, if you talk about to representation with certain language, is not so simple. Just to refer to like you don't have the ability to represent it with Chinese. I think it's very complex. It's first comment. 然后第二个就是我自己是有点觉得，就是如果我们要再去讨论这个。就是我觉得它其实也会有一点阶级的问题，就是因为写作的人或者是书写的人，他们是属于特殊的一群知识分子。那其实我觉得不完全是因为，比如说我们使用英文去写作，其实很多他所在线的人，其实并不是他自己有能力去写作的那些人，所以其实这是我们在选择。这是我们在看这个时候，它可能会有一些另外一个在线的张力，就是不是语言的那个在线张力。就I try to translate for myself, or Alex, you want to translate for myself? Okay, so I was talking about that the political representation is very complex because those who have the ability to write or have the leisure, maybe they belong to certain intellectuals, but those who are represented by these intellectuals are necessary with certain skill or the ability to represent themselves. So it became very, it's also very challenging to talk about this project. When we try to understand the city with literature, but of course it's still very brilliant or very interesting project to explore. So we also looking forward to have another edition in the coming year, or also maybe in Taiwan. Okay, so we will need to
Want to like answer or respond to Raiki's comments?
One last question. Yeah, sorry. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, because KL is in itself extremely complex, that's for sure. But have you guys thought about doing it in other places? Because if you want to make it even more complex, we can go to Penang, right? And then we can go to Kelantan. But then again, my concern is Penang, because I am from Penang, right? So any similar kind of projects going on there?
For sure, because I do believe in decentering the project. So it's good for people in his own community to actually to pick up the project, actually to do it in different places and all. So because this is actually this project actually being funded by Think City as well. So Think City is a urban think tank affiliated with the government, actually. So because they're also active in Penang, so we actually have this idea actually to further this project to different places. But it's good for its own community who are actually going to start with. Maybe we can actually collaborate together, but not entirely like going there and do it for the community there. Yeah. But yeah, we mentioned about Penang. Penang is very much interesting because that's where the first printing and publishing company was being set up in Malaysia, and also in Kelantan, because that's where most of the earliest magazine during the pre-colonial period or even colonial period was being published. So for sure, there must be a lot of interesting ideas or even intertwining process of urbanization, or not necessarily urbanization, but modernization itself. Yeah. Because to talk about urbanization in Kelantan is very much problematic as well. Because what kind of urban setting that we can actually experience there, for example. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, sure.
It's not working. Oh, it's working.
It's working now.
So I have maybe a response to what Raiki said. This politics of representation, which I think can be connected as well to the problems of discipline, because I reflect back to what Kunci did with the project in Hong Kong, where we made the anthology of with migrant workers, made the reading group, and produced an anthology of texts that we read, but also texts that we wrote together. One of the discussion that we had in Jogja at the time about the book, there was one question which asked, is this really a literature? Can we evaluate the works of migrant workers based on the criteria when we assess a real literature, like done by scholars or intellectuals? So in this sense, I think when I see there is a potential on connecting the spatial or the material such as city with literature, but I also see the potential of this comparative, that it has a potential of revising both discipline or both category, that how we can rethink of a literature through thinking through the city, like what are the productions of knowledge that doesn't fit yet with our idea of literature now, like not only based on race, but also based on class, on status, on maybe there are certain spaces or location in the city that are not enough represented as much as the city center, for example. Also, maybe there are certain places or spaces that, or a certain location that should remain secret or not being written because it will prevent, it will resist or prevent any authorship or ownership. Once it's being written, then it's easily to be claimed, for example. So I see there are a lot of potential in talking about these connections of city and literature, as well as how this connection can be used to rethink the boundaries that already exist in both discussions of both topics.
Maybe I would love to elaborate more on, because just now you mentioned about the problem of discipline, but it also came with the ideas of authoritativeness. So for this particular project, it also something that we have discussed further with some of my workmates about, is it possible for us to include the zine or even magazine, self-published magazine by the migrant workers, or even for some of the literary circle in Malaysia, for example, or even the work in the internet to be involved in this particular project. But it's a good starting point so that we actually have a corpus so that people can actually, oh, it is actually possible for us to do this. Maybe we can actually explore more and working more together, and then we can actually include with even zine or self-published magazine, or even the literature works in the internet. Yeah. So yeah, that's one of the potential that we're looking at actually as well. All right. Question? Want to show some pictures?
Okay. Yeah. So maybe I can show some pictures. I think I would like to follow up the comments by Raiki and Tina. This is the picture that involved during my residency in KL. Also, okay. How to do this? Okay, so during my research, actually my research mainly focused on the Japanese occupation period in Asia regions. And so this is the prostitutions immigrants to Malaysia, and during the 1920s and 1950s, during that time. And after that, they kind of live as prostitutions in Malaysia, Thailand, and also Singapore. And because I want to do this kind of transnational immigrants research, so I also discussed with Zikri to know more about not only the prostitutions from Japan, also the soldier from Taiwan who speak Japanese during that time, sent to Malaysia as a Japanese soldier in prison site. So this kind of people and immigrants, as Dina mentioned, that many of them cannot produce certain kind of literature and writings, sample or work for the people, for us to understand their life, their emotion, their memories in Malaysia. So I want to end this talk with this kind of conclusion that maybe the second version of Literacity can move further to this kind of migration site, not only this kind of archival research, but also, for example, the new urban development happened very quick right now in KL, also in whole Malaysia. Send a lot of laborers from Bangladesh, also the South Asians. And one amazing picture that I saw in Bangladesh is took by Shahidul Alam, and he captured the picture of the graveyard of Bangladesh labor workers in Malaysia. Some of them die in Malaysia, but nobody noticed. And so actually, one of the labor just find a place, a land to bury their colleagues in the place near KL. So I think this kind of site and space is quite interesting to explore more, maybe from different perspective, not only from the literature, but from the humanity understanding to involve them in this kind of projects, to imagine maybe what kind of future, what kind of a city in the future we want to develop or build up. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for joining us today, by the way. Thank you, and thank you, Raiki, for organizing the amazing residency program. And also Dina, one of the